This video will help you decide if you should set up a trust before you die. If you don't know who I am, my name's Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. When putting together a robust, holistic financial plan, one core competency is going to be estate planning. Unfortunately, when you start Googling estate planning, it's not long before you come across things such as, you should always go set up a trust, and trusts help you avoid taxes, but then trusts have their own tax rates, as well as trusts help you maintain privacy, whatever that means. You might also have some preconceived notions that trusts are really only for the ultra wealthy. Depending on your experience, you might have experienced trust fund kiddos that you don't want your kids or your heirs to turn out to be like, and so that might leave a bad taste in your mouth. At any rate, in today's video, we'll help you figure out if you should set up a trust before you die. So let's jump in. To lay a foundation for our talk today, I put together a previous video that breaks down the differences between a revocable and an irrevocable trust. Now, technically, you don't need to know the difference for this video, but I do find it helpful to come in with a little bit of a foundation, so I'd recommend checking out that video before this. Either way, let's apply the general guidance of knowing how revocable and irrevocable trusts work to determine if it makes sense to set up either one for you before you die. As a quick definition of terms, anytime you hear the term living trust, that refers to a trust that was established while you're living. And anytime you hear the term testamentary trust, that refers to trusts that are set up via your last will and testament, aka after you die. In my opinion, the first biggest decision point as to whether or not you should look into setting up a trust ahead of time is to avoid the probate process. Probate is the process where the courts ultimately decide what happens to your property after you're gone. Now, if you have a last will and testament, the courts 99% of the time will follow that guidance and distribute property accordingly. If you don't have a last will and testament, things will oftentimes pass towards next of kin, and that usually serves as a great plot device for a number of different movies and TV shows out there when there isn't a will to dictate what happens and the courts have to find the next of kin. A living trust, on the other hand, can avoid the probate process because living trust assets pass outside of probate when you die. And this might be advantageous for a few reasons. Number one, the probate process can be lengthy. So if you have heirs or mouths to feed that are depending on your assets to go to them, if the probate process is lengthy, it might be a while before those heirs will receive those financial instruments that they need to support their lifestyle. The probate process can also be expensive. Generally, you'll have to hire an attorney for an hourly rate to wade through the probate process. And by definition, that just eats away at the net estate that otherwise would be going towards your heirs. Generally, the more complicated your estate is, the lengthier and more expensive the probate process will be if things end up going through probate. Going back to the lengthy probate process, with a last will and testament that dictates certain accounts need to go to certain places, that means that the heirs are going to need to speak with these financial institutions to get the money released to them. And every financial institution is going to have their own minutely different process for releasing funds to check all the boxes from a compliance standpoint. Whereas if the property is owned inside of a trust, it's a lot easier to say, hey, I'm a beneficiary of trust, and here's the death certificate. In addition, wills can be contested. If it's determined that you were under duress or you weren't of cognitive faculty enough to affirmatively sign for this last will and testament, it's possible that the will could be contested and that the wishes you wrote out in the will might not be fulfilled. Now, trusts can also be contested, but it's not as common because trusts pass outside of probate, whereas wills and last will and testaments, for example, are matters of public record. So it's a lot less common that you'll have some random third uncle coming out of the woodwork to contest your trust, and it's far more likely that you could see contest of will because those are public. So if you want to avoid probate, it'll definitely make sense to look into setting up a living trust. Now, this is also assuming that you have probate assets, and most people do, but to quickly define that, probate assets are assets that if they're not held inside of a trust, they will go through the probate process. And these would be financial instruments that you've titled individually. Things like maybe concentrated stock brokerage accounts through your employer, or certain property, including business interests that might be titled individually. Basically anything that isn't jointly held with you and a spouse or somebody else, nor has a beneficiary designation. If you have probate assets, then if you pass away without a living trust, they will go through probate. Probate assets are in direct contrast to non-probate assets, which easily defined as everything else, but in reality, it's more so things that have beneficiary designations with them or that are held jointly with you and somebody else, most often your spouse. And these would be financial instruments like life insurance policies, retirement accounts, annuities, etc. Now, when it comes to jointly held property, well, technically these would be considered non-probate assets because they would directly go to the joint owner. I typically like to think of these as probate assets nonetheless, because it's not hard to imagine that after the first spouse passes away, the second spouse now owns this property individually, and that non-probate asset quickly turned into a probate asset. And if they don't update the ownership of that into a trust of some kind, then when they pass away, those assets will go through probate now. Theoretically, I guess your entire net worth could be comprised of non-probate assets, and then in that case, you don't need a trust for the purposes of avoiding probate because everything would pass outside of probate. But most people have some form of probate assets, including like checking and savings accounts. On the matter of which trust to establish, it doesn't matter if you set up a living trust as a revocable or irrevocable trust, both will bypass probate. However, if your goal in this case is simply to avoid probate in the simplest, cheapest way possible with the least complexity, generally a living revocable trust will be the easiest way to accomplish this. It's not necessary to establish an irrevocable trust and move property outside of your estate before you pass away if the sole goal is just to avoid the probate process. Now, that topic segues nicely into the second main reason, in my opinion, to consider establishing a living trust before you die, and that is in the pursuit of simplicity. Now, without a doubt, it's not the simplest thing to establish a trust, either revocable or irrevocable, move assets into that trust, aka retitle assets, and start titling future assets in the name of the trust. That can oftentimes not be the simplest thing to do. And this is particularly the case when it comes to irrevocable trusts, because those require a trustee that's not you, so some third-party entity, either a person or a corporation of some kind, to serve as essentially the manager of the trust. So there's coordination there. In addition, that trust will need to file for its own EIN, which is basically a social security number, and there's administration and logistics to consider there. And if the trust kicks off or earns any income, you'll need to file a separate tax return underneath the trust's EIN, and there's logistics and costs and CPA expenses and things like that that could go into that as well. In contrast to a revocable living trust, which does not require somebody else to be the trustee, you could be the trustee yourself. It doesn't require a separate EIN, and it doesn't have to file its own tax return, as everything just flows through to you as the grantor. On the topic of revocable living trusts, a lot of people will find it simple to know that there's one uniform titling method or one uniform beneficiary designation, and everything just goes into the trust. As opposed to figuring out the correct titling of all your individual estate pieces, it can make more sense just to title everything underneath that one trust. Now, point of clarification, if you do move in the direction of setting up a trust, please know that just because you establish the trust doesn't mean that it's actually effective. To actually make the trust valuable, you need to retitle your existing assets in the name of the trust or future assets. You also need to move, for example, your primary residence and other properties into the trust that you want the trust to shroud inside of the shell of non-probate, essentially. And that would look like updating the deeds, retitling investment accounts, updating beneficiary designations, and things like that. Nothing happens just because you create a trust and get it notarized. Again, some people might find this process simple. Open a new bank account, title it in the trust. Open a joint investment account, title it in the name of the trust. Other people might find this very obnoxious and complex to remember. And so for those folks, in the pursuit of simplicity, they would not want to look into setting up a revocable living trust. In my opinion, it's not that complicated, but if you don't have a strong financial acumen or dealing with financial instruments just brings you a bunch of anxiety, then it might not be in your best interest to look into setting up the trust. Generally, you would not title and move all beneficiary designations into an irrevocable living trust. That would cause you to lose control of these assets. And so generally for the purposes of an irrevocable living trust, that would be for a particular asset or group of assets that you for sure don't want access to in the future. And that definitely brings complexity and does not simplify things. So at the end of the day, setting up a living trust ahead of time can bring a tremendous amount of simplicity to your world, but for some folks, they might see that simplicity as complexity. And so it really just depends on your financial acumen and your interpretation of how this could make your life work. This complexity, simplicity concern further segues into, in my opinion, the third most common reason to look to set up a living trust ahead of time, and that's the cost. To establish a trust, you're generally going to want to hire an attorney to assist with making sure the documents are effective and then that everything follows the right processes to get notarized, etc. Now, this comes at a financial cost as well as a little bit of a time commitment, but not dramatic. Technically, you can establish trusts without hiring an attorney, but then those costs are just flipped. So rather than a financial cost with a small time commitment, it's the other way around, where it's probably a very high time commitment for you to figure out how to do everything correctly, and then maybe a small financial cost to purchase software or something like that. There's also the implicit cost if you end up doing things yourself that you made a mistake. And there's no one to quality assure that everything checks out perfectly, so potentially your trust might be ineffective even if you spend a ton of time and a small amount of financial resources. At the end of the day, it could totally be a waste of time anyways. I found working with estate planning attorneys that if you sign up to get a package done, like your will, powers of attorney, medical powers of attorney, healthcare directives, etc., then generally if you throw in, hey, I want to establish a trust ahead of time, it's cheaper to do it when they're already in the rigmarole of optimizing your estate. Whereas if you do a one-off, please go set up this trust hourly rate, it's probably going to be just a little bit more expensive. Now, obviously, you're going to want to speak to some attorneys and get some quotes, but my point is that if you can get it all done at the same time, you might benefit from like a bundled pricing effect. So ultimately, these costs, whether it's financial, time cost, or risk cost that you did things wrong, those all might influence whether or not you want to pursue setting up a living trust. In addition, if you look to set up an irrevocable living trust, on top of all the other costs we just talked about, the irrevocable living trust is going to have their own costs associated with it. So for example, since you can't be the trustee yourself, you'll need to hire some third party. Either it's a family member or a friend, and they may or may not want a fee to manage the trust. Definitely if you hire a corporate trustee, so a company that functions as the trustee, then that's going to have its own cost. Since the trust is now its own separate entity and has its own social security number, if you will, EIN number, you'll probably need to file a tax return every year if the trust produces income. Now, most irrevocable trusts I've run into produce some type of income. Now, some don't, but generally, if you plan on having money in there for a while, it'll probably produce some income at some point. And that'll have a cost, either time-wise, you'll need to invest in doing a tax return, or financially, you'll need to hire a tax professional to produce the tax return for you. And then, of course, at the end of every tax return, our tax is owed. And that's a direct financial cost to Uncle Sam. On the flip side, though, if you don't set up any living trusts, but in your last will and testament, you have a testamentary trust said to be established, then during the probate process, you'll need to hire an attorney to establish that trust, and that has its own financial costs associated with it. So whether you pay the fees ahead of time to get all the trusts established, or you pay the fees after you're gone via your estate, via a testamentary trust, you're probably gonna have to hire some form of attorney to assist in drafting the trust. Personally, I'd rather just get it all done ahead of time for the insurance that everything's gonna go according to plan. So calls to action-wise, I would examine your current situation and see if it makes sense to implement some form of living trust ahead of time. 90% of the time, if you are moving in the direction of setting up a trust, it's going to be a revocable living trust, although there are some circumstances where an irrevocable living trust could make sense, and for that, you can see some of my previous videos. If you do move in this direction, you're probably going to want to speak to an estate planning attorney, even though technically you can do things on your own. At the end of the day, I'm not an estate planning attorney, so I don't assist in producing the documents for a client, but we do provide advice and guidance on how to construct an estate plan effectively, keeping in mind the rest of your financial plan. But to clarify, I'm not an attorney. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below or get in touch on the website. We'll get you squared away. Have an awesome rest of your week. We'll talk to you later. Bye.